Welcome to Life in Red.
All right, April, thank you so much for joining me on this, well, as we record, sort of gloomy, cloudy, less humid day here in Ottawa.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
You came to me after sort of an episode we both did on our good pal Angelica's The Revolutionized Mind. So obviously this episode is going to be mental health and everything. You are a trauma recovery coach. And I'm super curious, just to start off and sort of get a context of everything that you do. What is a trauma recovery coach? I know it sounds sort of self-explanatory, but what sort of are the things that you do, and how does that maybe differ or help maybe work in tandem with something like going to see a therapist about something with trauma?
Yeah, so I like to first say, like, we're different from life coaches. So a lot of people think like I'm a life coach or I'm a therapist. And I'm not trained in therapy. I am no training that at all, though our program was designed, one of the ladies who designed it is a former therapist. But she noticed things missing in the therapy field to help trauma survivors. And a lot of us trauma recovery coaches are trauma survivors ourselves. And the best way they describe it in the association is the therapists are like the surgeons, front line, they're dealing with the crises and all that. Like, I'm not trained either to deal with crises or anything. So, but as coaches, we come in as the peer, the mentor. We're helping you set your recovery goals. It's all client-led. There's no talk therapy. Clients dive into what they want to dive into. We're not diving into their traumas or past. We basically, if they're in the ditch, we go sit with them in the ditch. We meet them where they are. And like, I have both. I have my own therapist and I have my own trauma recovery coach. And they actually work really well hand in hand together. Because when I'm doing therapy, I knew that something was different in my own journey. So then I reached out to one of the coaches in the association and being coached with her. And it's like, okay, now things are piecing together better. Now things are making a little bit more sense in my journey. Because I'm setting different goals. I'm starting to dive into more of my trauma responses and everything. So it's like trauma recovery coaches, we're on that line with the therapist, but we're kind of like, if you need to talk about your mental health or your crisis, we'll work hand in hand with your therapist, but we're not trained to do any of that. We're not trained to diagnose or anything. We're just there to help you in your recovery part.
So like a team, you know, you're working together all as a team to sort of help people get through whatever they're sort of going through and recover from whatever they did go through.
Exactly.
So I want to talk about you. And I know you're very forthcoming with your story, but I also know that trauma and recovery and everything is a deep subject. So go into your story as deep as you would like to go, but kind of maybe start from the beginning. Is mental health something you've always sort of struggled with, or at least maybe like was in sort of your life, your family, or did it all come from sort of, whether it was, I'll let you tell the story, but the event or the events that happened to you?
Yeah, so my story actually starts back in 2012 with my first diagnosis of depression, but I was actually showing signs and symptoms way before that. And so that was my second semester at university. But in my first semester, and I just moved away from home. I was a transfer student, so I was taking courses in first, second, third year. And by the second week, I knew something was off. And I went to the guidance counselor or the counselor on campus, and I was showing all the signs and symptoms of depression. He just looks at me. He's like, "You're homesick. Just go back to your apartment. You'll be fine in 2 weeks." Well, the new semester in 2012 came in. And I'm like, something's still off. And so I was 6 hours away from home. Ottawa's home for me. Grew up here. So I came back to my family doctor, and the resident, they do the PHQ-9 test with you for depression, the paper test, but it's all like all these things about how you've been feeling in the past 2 weeks. And he looked at my responses. He's like, yeah, you have depression. And my family doctor said, you most likely went undiagnosed for years. And I think it started when I was sometime in high school. But at that time, I didn't know my depression was a root cause of something deeper. So I went through, going on medication. I was able to come off it in 2 years, figuring out what healing meant to me. And then in 2016, after an unexpected breakup, I ended up being diagnosed with anxiety. And at that time, I didn't know my anxiety was the root cause of something deeper. In early 2019, I was in a mall in London with my then boyfriend, now fiance, and I was assaulted. And that triggered me. That is still one of my traumas I still don't want to deal with because of the way it makes me feel. I feel sick to my stomach with that one. So that was like a slow ball that got rolling for that one. And then in January 2020, I moved back home and everything was downhill from there. I started experiencing insomnia, flashbacks, my anxiety was through the roof and I couldn't figure out why. And my other therapist at the time, I was starting to piece things together and I was like, okay, I don't remember much about my childhood. And your subconscious mind has a way of blocking out certain things that you're not ready to deal with. But it was just a lot of other things were coming up for me. So I sat down and I wrote down all these different traumatic events I went through without realizing they were either complex PTSD or PTSD. So throughout my life, I have been through bullying. So I was bullied from elementary all the way up to my first year of college. I was verbally sexually harassed. I was assaulted, as I mentioned. I survived various kinds of abuse. And most recently, medical trauma. So days before the very first lockdown, my doctor diagnosed me with PTSD. And then months later, when I started with a new therapist, she also diagnosed me with complex PTSD. So the difference between the two is PTSD is a single time event, and complex, it's where it's repeated over time. So more like those combat zones and childhood abuse sort of thing. That's what the examples they use for complex. And then the medical trauma comes from my endometriosis, because my body just likes to murder me on a monthly basis. So it's just been a lot, it was all one things at once. It was trying to handle everything, but I decided to use my story to not only inspire others and get the word out about PTSD and all that, but to also start something. And I decided to share the good, the bad, and the ugly.
First of all, thank you for sharing that. I know even though you may do it a number of times and do interviews and speeches, every time you do it, it does take a little piece. And I know that. So thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
What was the light bulb moment where, because that's what I'm always curious with people who sort of advocate and get into a more community-led role when it comes to this. What was the moment that took you from trying to heal, trying to get better, trying to, work on yourself to, I also want to help other people with this? Was there one particular moment? Was there several moments that led to that decision? Take me through that.
Ever since 2014, when I finished my internship on the military base in Petawawa, I knew I wanted to do something in mental health, but I didn't know what. And it took my own diagnoses to be okay, this feels right. And I had a personal public Instagram account, but it wasn't really mental health driven at that point, but I was still sharing parts of my journey. And I kept being told I was in beach body at the time, they kept saying, you got to stop sharing the negative. You got to stop being this. You got to put this positive spin on it. I'm like, no, that's toxic positivity. No one's going to understand really what you're going through if you're going to put the positive spin on it. Like, I don't put a positive spin on my hard days.
Mm-hmm.
I don't put the positive spin on like, I'm going through a flashback, but like that doesn't exist. So I had to like also distance myself from them, actually completely leave Beachbody. And at the same time, I was starting my certification in the trauma recovery coaching through they have a really long name, International Association of Trauma Recovery Coaches.
Tongue twister.
It is. And my degree is really long too. So I have a lot of tongue twisters. But it was through that I knew at that point I was going to build something. And I was already rebranding at that time when I started that course. And I've always been that person who knew I was called to help others. I always knew I was meant to do something in my community. And living in smaller cities and towns throughout Ontario, because I moved a lot in like 6 years, the resources were really different. When I was living in Renfrew, I didn't have the same resources as I did in Ottawa. Stratford was different from St. Catharines.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I compare everything to Ottawa. And I was like, I want to create something virtually and keep speaking, because those smaller cities and towns don't have the same resources. They don't know what's really out there. And so it's just different parts of my own healing journey, and all that is what took me to what I'm doing today. And also, like, I have a background in recreation leisure. That's what I studied in college and university. And when I was first diagnosed in 2020, I'm like, okay, I'm falling back on this. I did research on myself. And through that, I found like I'm healing in different ways. So that's what I also brought in and bringing forward is like, healing is more than yoga and medication and meditation and all those things. So it's just like, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
I was like, trying to remember.
It's a little bit of all those things too, right? It's not just one or the other. I always like to say in my speeches when I'm talking to people that it's like a combination of things. You're working through this whole sort of different routines, and nothing's right or wrong as long as like it's working for you. You get to kind of choose what you implement in your own journey. Trauma and PTSD is something we've covered on this podcast a few times now. The way I hear you describe it, so obviously you had the significant event in London, but what I really took from your story is sort of all these things that I think society sort of minimizes in a way. So you mentioned bullying, right? We consider that as sort of like part of our childhood, like the rite of passage. You talked about, sexual harassment and everything. And, women now are being very loud and vocal, rightfully so, about the effects of that. But I think for a long time, and especially, as we were growing up, like, that was just a normal part of sort of an everyday thing for a woman. All these things you were kind of talking about that led to this diagnosis of CPTSD. I think, again, society doesn't really think as a big deal. I'll use air quotes there for those listening. Can you speak to the effects of sort of these things? Again, these led to a very severe outcome for you. How does it feel like sort of like every day with that stuff happening, someone's tearing a little piece from you? Like, talk to me about those feelings of, not so much because when we think of PTSD, we think of like the veterans, or we think about this like very serious event. We don't think about the things that just are ongoing like every day. How did that like sort of really affect you? And how did it make you feel? Like, what was sort of like going through your mind?
Yeah. So the one thing we like to say and bust one myth is a person doesn't experience the PTSD right after a traumatic event. It can take years. For me, it took, I'm trying to remember how old I was in 2020, 29. It took me like that long to realize I've been through everything. And healing is a cycle. It's not linear. It goes through up and down. I could be in one part of the healing journey, like in growth for one part of my traumas, and another one I can be in denial stage again. I go through good days and bad days. When I'm having flashbacks, or I'll use my assault, for example, because that one still eats me up to this day. I will deal with flashbacks and night terrors still, to the point like my insomnia got so bad I had to get put on sleeping medication. I will have angry outbursts, and that's completely normal. Like we all get angry. We never make that connection between our emotions and feelings. And then we usually get shut down for trying to talk about our emotions and feelings. There are days I'm crying. There's days I feel absolutely numb. I have no emotions. Like I'm trying to show up on social media myself, and I'm just like, I can't. And I get honest. This assault actually still makes me physically sick whenever certain parts of it comes up. Because there are still people out there who think it was my fault, or they get in their heads like, they try to make excuses for that person. And it's like, you are not there. You did not witness what happened. So I still deal with so this guy reached over to me on the escalator. I was looking the other way with my fiance, and he ran his hand up my arm, and I felt it. And I stood in shock, because when we looked down the escalator afterwards, him and his buddy were laughing. And I called my dad, and I'm like, what do I do? Like, and he's like, you were assaulted. Go report this. So we had to go report it to the mall security, who really didn't care. We reported it to the police, and my future brother-in-law is actually a cop. So I said to my fiance, I'm like, can you just call your brother? And it's like, I wasn't sure like what was going to happen, because I've never had to do this before. And so like the cops didn't really do much. So there was like a lot of like frustration, hurt, and I still deal with those emotions to this day. And then there's days where like I'm perfectly happy. I'm not dealing with flashbacks or anything. I'm just a normal 31-year-old woman. So there's a lot of times where something will trigger me, and I work with those triggers, and then I have to go but in my healing, I became more aware. Okay, this is my trigger. What boundary do I need to set? And I need to sit with these feelings and emotions instead of stuffing them and just trying to go on with my day, which I still do.
Yeah. Do you feel like you get minimized that, because what I find, like what I've learned through, years of doing this podcast and years in the mental health community, is that like an assault, we sort of place as like we sort of like have a hierarchy for like severity, right? We kind of are like, this is the worst, and like, and then you go down the list. And I think oftentimes we might minimize something that we perceive as not being as egregious as maybe something else, yet tend to, like I said, sort of minimize the victim and be like, oh, that's not that bad. Or, like, oh, it could have been worse, or, something like that. Whereas like the victim, is feeling everything exactly like the body almost doesn't distinguish sort of like the hierarchy that our other people do, right? Like our body and our mind perceive the assault as like, it's just the assault, a violation of our privacy. Do you deal with that? Do you sort of, whether it's external or internal or anything, do you grapple with sort of that sort of idea of the way we view assault as maybe like a culture and a society?
There has been times like there's still that stigma, and I've seen it with the different kinds of abuse too. through different people reaching out to me and talking to me. And even like domestic abuse is still like the one on the high hierarchy, right?
Right.
But then like the emotional and financial and those type of abuse, it gets, like, as you said, minimalized. And it's like, there's that stigma of, oh, you could have had it worse, or I lived this, so I had it worse. And it's like, that doesn't make it right. No one's trauma should be compared to someone else's trauma. No one's experiences should be compared, because we all deal with things differently. We all, like, the severity is different to everyone. Like a car crash, for example, one person may develop PTSD while someone else may not. That doesn't diminish the person who has PTSD from it. They might have been in a different situation with it. They might have been sitting somewhere different in the car, but their story and their diagnosis is still valid.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something with society that we're still dealing with to this day of, you know, as you said, you could have had it worse, or, you know, at least you're not living here in this war country or something. And that's kind of unfair to say. And really, that's also people who are saying that are not very trauma informed. And sometimes they also have their own things they don't want to deal with themselves. So they're just pushing it all away. And that's your shadow at work there, because your shadow will mirror your emotions and everything in others when you don't want to acknowledge it in yourself. So a lot of times when we get those diminished feelings, it's either because people are not really trauma informed, or they're like not dealing with themselves. And here, as trauma survivors, we're taking the brunt of it all.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think a lot of what we see on social media, a lot of sort of reactions to things, you know, I think in a way is a trauma response, that they're triggered in a way, and then they're sort of like, they're deflecting the way they're feeling on you, or you know, again, the minimizing, which I always think like, oh, well, I went through that and I was fine. Well, one, again, I love that you said don't compare traumas, and two, are you really fine? You know, like, it's like the people on social media, whenever the debate about spanking kids comes up, they're like, I was spanked and I'm fine. Like, but are you sure? Like, you're commenting on Facebook about this. Like, are you trying to tell me, or are you trying to tell yourself? And I think, you know, I think almost all of us in one way or another have experienced some form of physical, emotional, mental trauma. And then you just see like a large part of the world, just, or population, just not deal with that and never, ever try to deal with it.
Yeah, it's kind of sad that people don't want to deal with it. But then, like, it's a lot of work. Like, you have to be in the right mindset and the right place to do it. Like, when I got the diagnosis first, I wasn't like, I knew I wanted to get help. I knew what I wanted to do, but I wasn't in the place yet to do it. And then once I was, that's when I started reaching out for help. And that's the other side of it. A lot of us survivors are afraid to reach out for help because of that stigma, because of like how it's perceived, how we're always told like it's therapy, or nothing against therapy, but I know it doesn't work for everybody. Mm-hmm. Or they had those bad experiences, or like rehashing our stories over and over gets so much harder. Like, there's times, and I was saying my story earlier, like I could almost start crying. And that's perfectly normal. That's perfectly okay. Like, this is what I have to live with for the rest of my life. But it's like, I wish social media would show more of that truth, instead of the people, as you said, with the spanking, being like, oh, I did it, I'm fine. Like, as you said, really? Like, they might be totally fine because their subconscious mind is protecting them, or they just don't want to deal with the truth. And there's just so many influencers out there with the toxic positivity, with saying like one way of mental health, and it's like, no, like, do you really understand? Do you really get what's going on? And I actually stopped following those kind of people, because they'll all of a sudden say to me like, doesn't matter. Or I had someone say on one of my posts, like, I was talking about inner child healing, about these different emotions that your anger outbursts and these things, and it's perfectly okay, because that's something inside you trying to need to come out. And this person's like, grow up.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And I'm like, I didn't have to defend myself. I had followers go defend what I was saying, but it was like, really, dude? Like, do you have anything else better to do with your time than go and be a Karen?
That that happens with me all the time too. You know, talk about men's mental health. But then you see it for what it is. Once you know, it's like you see it in all things. You like someone is lashing out, you're like, oh yeah, I get it. You know, I triggered you. I'm sorry. It makes sense. One of the things you brought up that I really want to touch on here, you mentioned I wasn't ready, but then when I was, I tried to get help. You know, like people aren't in that point where they're ready to heal, because like you said, like healing is hard. The resources we have, we're still in a patriarchal society. And when you think about things that are traditionally supposed to help, the medical field, therapy, those types of things, right? The view that sometimes even professionals and stigma around women or Black people or Indigenous people, whether it's from their own ignorance or their own biases, is still rampant. So it can be, you're right, it can be scary. And it can be harder than maybe someone like me who's trying to get help. How do you get to the point where you're ready? How do you get to that step where something's happened, you're trying to deal with it, but you're not quite ready to take that step? How did you get to that point? How do people go about getting to that point where they can really start moving forward?
I think it depends on the person and where they're at. So as I mentioned, like my depression diagnosis was undiagnosed for years, and I showed the signs and symptoms, but I didn't go get the help because it wasn't talked about in the early 2000s. Whereas when my diagnosis in 2020, I've already been through 2 diagnoses that I'm like, I just knew with all my symptoms and everything that like I couldn't keep living this way. And usually when a person's to a point of like, I can't keep living like this, I want to be able to hang out with friends again. I want to be able to live. I want to live the life I want to. I want to be happy. Because that all exists inside ourselves. But you just have to be in that mindset, because you cannot be in denial for what happened to you. You cannot be in denial for the emotions and feelings you face. Because in my business, I do a lot of the inner child work and shadow work. So it's like, you can't be in denial of those feelings. And you need to be ready to know you're going to take a few steps forward and then 5 steps back, because it's not linear. And I knew I was also ready because I knew I didn't want to work with men for my own professional circle of care, just because the majority of my abusers were men. So I honestly did research. I researched what was out there. I researched different therapists, their backgrounds, and it's different for everybody for where they're at in their journey. Because I've seen it where I've had some ladies book discovery calls with me and then end up rescheduling that day of their call. And it's not because it's something I did or they did, it's to the point of, oh, I have this and I'm not quite ready. Mm-hmm. But taking that first step to book that call is a huge step. And I like give yourself on a pat on the shoulder for that. But taking that next step is going to be like, it's almost like a talk with yourself to be like, okay, like I can't keep living like this. I need to do this next. And it's like that planning out steps. And it's like as we do in coaching, we set those goals, but we break them down into action steps. And I think that's what I probably did, is I knew what I needed and I broke it down. But I also knew, like, being from recreation and leisure, I decided to be like, okay, I'm going to try watercolor. I'm going to try wood burning. I'm going to get back out in nature. So it wasn't just services I was looking for. I was also falling back on activities that benefited me. So sometimes people are not ready to make that step to reach out for help. They can be like, okay, maybe I'll find a community to be a part of, which are actually very hard to still find, those communities. Or they could be like, I love nature, I'll start spending more time in nature. So even steps like that are good steps to take if you're still scared to reach out for that professional help.
You've mentioned shadow work a couple times and inner child work a couple times. For people who may not be familiar, can you describe that a little bit, and like what goes into sort of, I mean, it's a complex sort of process, obviously, but like what are some of the things you do to start working on that or start recognizing it?
Yeah, so the shadow work is like these sides of us, like those feelings, emotions we don't like our judgment side, or angry, like those type of emotions and such, that we just bury. We just dismiss them like, oh, they don't exist in me. And we keep ignoring them. And the point of shadow work is to acknowledge them and to work with them, to be like, okay, you're here. I'm going to acknowledge you. I'm going to see what you need. It's not being like, okay, angry Alice, call her that. I name all my emotions. This is what they say in shadow work to do. And it's like, okay, what do you need today? And if I sit with that feeling, I don't dismiss it. I'd be like, hey, what's the root cause of anger? And if it's being reflected back to me in a person, it's like, okay, where in my life am I angry? And there's a bunch of different exercises and everything. I actually started shadow work with my life coach before I started doing trauma recovery coaching. So I'm back to reading a book and these different exercises to bring into my practice. And then the inner child is, well, we often hear the reparenting of the inner child. And I don't like that word. I really don't, because our inner child is like that 3-year-old or 12-year-old or 15-year-old, like any age of us inside ourselves who was wounded when we were younger. And a lot of times people are like, well, sit and meditate or write to them. And it's like, that doesn't work for everyone. So this is where I bring in, again, recreation leisure, because it's like, you heal through play. Like, I know inside 8-year-old me, because I had a conversation with her, misses kicking around a soccer ball. And it's like, okay, I need to go kick around a soccer ball. I can't at the moment because of a tear in my hip, but it's like, I know these different things through exercises I've done. So a lot of these inner child and shadow work is done through different exercises by someone who's trained in it, or like me, is taking what I'm learning. Like, there are self-help books, but those are really written by the person who's going through the issue at hand. I find self-help books aren't the greatest because they're not really helping you. But like, for inner child playing, I always say, let out that side of you that wants to play, that wants to get creative. And it's just this week I started bringing back in shadow work, and I'm like, okay, we're going to acknowledge these sides of you that you're dismissing again. But you have to be in the right mindset as well for these two type of healing. And I say like both these type of works are beautiful, because you start to take off the layers of what your abusers molded you to be. You start peeling back that mask, and you start to find the side of you of who you're meant to be, and you're rediscovering who she or he is. And a lot of that has to do with the inner work. So it's like two things at once. You're taking off that mask, and then you're redefining yourself.
I use an example of myself without it's like loosely knowing these terms, but doing it without ever naming it. As I go back to the beginning of the pandemic and sort of how I had to pick myself up from a very low spot. The inner child work, the play, I bought a bike. I started playing basketball and just shooting some hoops because I used to do that as a kid, playing computer games. It's almost like sort of embracing the hobbies that just bring you joy for purely bringing you joy. Am I sort of along the right track for that?
You are, like you said, you started playing basketball again, like you did as a kid. And so like you're answering something within yourself without even realizing your inner child wanted that need.
Mm-hmm.
And like, that's really great. Like the pandemic really started people with picking up different hobbies and activities again. But then there's the other side of some of us are afraid to get back into old hobbies and activities because of bullying, of like a traumatic event. So then it's about discovering all new activities. For me, I never watercolored until last year. I never considered myself an artist. I'm not that bad, but it's like sometimes if you can't do something that you used to do, or there's something that interested you. In grade 7, 8, I was okay at art, and I'm like, that's what kept coming back to me. And I was like, okay, I'm going to explore this a little bit more. So sometimes like it can come to us like when we're not even, like you said, thinking about it. It just comes and we just feel like, oh, I feel like doing this today.
Is that one of your paintings behind you?
No, my fiance made me a sunflower for my birthday gift.
Oh, very cute.
Thank you.
With your experience with bullying, I'm sure there's probably a lot of like self-doubt, a lot of questions about yourself. Was it difficult for you to go on this new venture, to start a business, to put yourself out there on the like? I know when you're passionate about something, I feel this too. In a way, you sort of like don't care what other people think because you're like, this is what I want to do. But I think a lot of people are passionate about things, but don't want to start something because they have trauma of being sort of like ridiculed for whatever they're chasing, or they're afraid of, the anxiety of like the future. What are people going to say? Was that sort of difficult for you to make a decision like this and like really put yourself out there? And if so, how did you go about getting over that feeling?
My inner critic still likes to come out to like self-sabotage me. Like she'll never go away. Mm-hmm. And I did have that fear because I did have 2 little other businesses I did try to start and they both failed. And throughout my life, I've been told like by bullies and, like I'm not good enough. I won't succeed. And those are thoughts I still deal with. And it's about working through those blockages. I actually had a breakthrough the other day when I did hypnotherapy with my friend. She's trained doing it. And I was always skeptical about it at first. And I'm like, okay, you know what? Like my financial and career is where there's a huge blockage because again, that fear that I am not good enough, it's going to fail, and I found out where they came from. And it came from those type of people trying to mold me into someone I wasn't. And because, as I mentioned, like I already had an account at that time when I was talking about my mental health story, and I just rebranded it because I knew I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to jump in, but I'm going to do this the right way. I'm going to I start working with Jan Ditchfield at that time.
Yeah, she's been on the podcast.
Yeah. So I found her through other businesses and accounts that I was following. And I'm like, you know what? I want to do this business. I want to help others. I have this goal and I don't want my own thoughts to sabotage myself. And honestly, working with her, going through her boot camp, her business academy, and now being part of her membership society, it's really helped me along the way. Because if I didn't have that support, I'd probably be drowning right now. I probably would have never found your podcast. Like, for me, it was about believing in myself and knowing I can, working with my inner critic, because we all have inner critics, they're always there. And just reminding myself my past doesn't hold my future in its hands. So just doing all that and just believing in myself, like, trust me, I still feel like my business is going to fail some days because it's a brand new field.
Mhm.
Like trauma, like we still deal with some therapists who think they should be the only ones working with trauma. When it's like, no, there's so many different fields that can work with trauma people. And so I'm still dealing with that stigma and that little bit of setbacks there. But I just have to keep reminding myself on those harder days with the business, with the Karen days, that I remind myself of what other friends and followers have said to me. And there's some days where I've been very vulnerable in my stories or in my posts, and they're like, thank you for sharing this. Like, this is what I need to hear. Or messages of like, I didn't know this was trauma. I didn't know this was what I was experiencing. Because we also talk about those different like trauma responses, right? So there's fight, flight, fawn, freeze. So those are the most common ones. So I've had people, and I talked about them, they're like, I didn't realize this was a trauma response. So I just have to keep reminding myself that I'm doing good. It's going to be a slow growth. And there's going to be days where negative Nancy is going to come in my head and be like, you can't do this. And all those past, flashbacks at times, but just reminding myself, like, I've already come so far in my journey that I can keep doing this.
Yeah. And I think, like you mentioned a little bit off the start, I know you talked about endometriosis. That's something I've covered and how much that affects women with the medical trauma. We talked about, how much harder it is, how you didn't want to deal with men in your recovery. And while there are women who are therapists, it's hard. So I think this as an avenue for women, people of the LGBTQ community, people, from marginalized communities. I think this is a really great avenue that could help them in ways that the traditional, the system we sort of already have set up that's overburdened as it is. This is a nice augmentation of that can really do a lot of good for people who traditionally have mistrust of the system and the people who are sort of in power and in place.
Yeah, for sure. And also being like, a lot of times as trauma survivors feel like we're most heard and most understood by someone else who's experienced what we've gone through. And usually therapists don't really say if they've gone through it or if they, what their experience is, unless you ask the question. But a lot of people don't know to ask those questions. And sometimes, as I said, talk therapy is not always doing it for someone. And they need that person who can be that role model to them and not be like, why didn't you hit your goal this week? But instead of being like, okay, let's break down why you didn't and how we can break this down so you can meet a little goal next week or what the blockage is. So it's more of like getting on that level of the survivor instead of that hierarchy of like, I'm educated in all this, you have to do it my way or the highway.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about those trauma responses, because I think you brought up a good point that I think we all know them subconsciously in a way, but like to name them seem to really resonate with people. So let's name them and go through them. So when you talk about fight, obviously sort of self-explanatory, but coming from a coach, how would you describe what that may look like to somebody?
That's more of like the aggression, the my gosh, I have it on my Pinterest, what it all is. It's just more like that angry side. You're like defending yourself all the time. I'm going to find it here.
No problem. Sort of like how men tend to gravitate towards this sort of mechanism as a trauma response, because we're taught that, we need to show strength and courage and that we won't back down and that we're still, over other people. So I think men definitely sort of gravitate more towards a fight sort of response when it comes to trauma.
Yeah. It is. So that's like more the explosive temper and outbursts, the controlling of others, the demands perfection from others. The flight is where you get obsessive or compulsive behavior, feeling of panic and anxiety, over worrying, workaholic, you can't sit still. You know, you try to micromanage situations with other people and always on the go.
Yeah, this is one I think a lot of people in the mental health community sort of struggle from, because sort of we might try to overcompensate the things that we're going through by helping other people. So we're like, we're just gonna help other people and not worry about our own stuff, and everything's gonna be great. We're gonna help, and you know, it's wonderful. But if you're not taking care of yourself, you're not gonna be really able to take care of other people. And this is one that really got to me, where people were like, oh yeah, like over helping, like, oh, is a trauma response. It's a flight response. And I always found that one particularly interesting.
Yeah, like mine out of the four, I'll get in the other two in a moment, but the flight was me.
Mm-hmm.
I always had to stay busy. I always had to stay on the go and doing something. And now, like, I took last week off social media for a break and I was still super busy. I'm like, why do I do this to myself? Like, I know I need to listen to myself, but I still had to jam pack.
Yeah.
Because when I ended up with COVID, everything got pushed back. And then I had all my medical testing, all that happening at once. I'm like, okay, it's like, I need a breather. Freeze is another one that we don't think of, but it's like the spacing out, the hibernating, isolating yourself from the outside world, dissociation, brain fog, you know, feels dead, lifeless. So a lot of times when we space out, we always have that excuse, right? I'm tired or something.
Yeah.
When it's like, no, like this is actually a trauma response, but people don't associate that because they're probably like, I don't have trauma, you know. And then fawn, these are the people pleasers. They're scared to say what they really think, you know, they flatter others, they overcaring, angel of mercy, that can't stand up for themselves. They're easily exploited by others. They're the yes man or woman. So a lot of trauma survivors are also people pleasers.
Yeah, you don't want to upset people, don't want to go through stuff again, you know, just want to keep everything good and smooth and easy. And that's another one I think a lot of people fall into without recognizing. A lot of people tend to gravitate away from conflict, you know, hard conversations. But again, we don't put that in the trauma response. And I don't think all these things too, for people who are listening, I don't think just because you exhibit one of these behaviors doesn't necessarily mean it's a trauma response. But these are like very good, clear indicators, like maybe something's going on and you should check in.
For sure. And like the other thing with the people pleasers too, and all these responses is our abusers tell us lies and we get told to believe those lies. And now that we're in the healing stage or the recovery stage, it's trying to undo those lies. So like I was told that lie of I'll never be good enough. I'll never succeed. So I'm still breaking down those lies of I will succeed. I'm already succeeding. I am going to do well in this. So it's just also like setting those boundaries. And as I said, like you're unmasking yourself now in this journey. You're taking off that mask and really discovering who you are. And it can be really scary because you're all of a sudden like, I don't know who I am without my traumas. We get so used to living in a world that is normal to us, in air quotes, but it's not normal.
Do you think people may over self identify with their traumas and sort of like form their own identity around it? And I'm curious because something I've worked on extensively over the years is not making my life like only about being a mental health advocate. You know, that's obviously a very important part of my life, something I'm very passionate about, but I don't want to box myself in like I'm just the mental health guy. You know, I'm more than that. I have other interests and hobbies and I do things. And sometimes I find particularly young people these days sort of cling to it as like an identity because maybe they found a community around it, or that's how they have their voices heard and they receive the support. Like, do you maybe find that? Is there something maybe in the literature that like, is that even a trauma response in itself? What are your thoughts on that?
You're the first person to ask me that. I
Like
haven't
the
seen
hard-hitting questions.
I think like I have seen it too, where people cling to that identity. Because again, as trauma survivors, we're scared to really know who we are without that. And they could find such comfort in being that person, but they're not allowing themselves to grow into who they really are. Like, I'm back to finding who I really am. And yes, I say myself, I'm a trauma survivor, I'm a trauma coach, I am a speaker, but I'm also all these different other things. I'm a fur mom, I'm a fiance, I am a daughter, a sister. Mm-hmm. There's so much to our own identity. So when these people kind of cling onto this one identity, it's something that I feel like they're scared to acknowledge in themselves, or they're scared to lose that community. Because once you find a community, it's like, oh my gosh, I simply belong. Like in my community I created, I always like, it's a private membership community, but it's like, if you feel like this is not meeting your needs anymore, that's perfectly fine, because you're going to continue to grow. As we grow, we heal, we grow. I'm not the same person I was at the beginning of the year. I was not the same person I was a year ago, 2 years ago. So my community and group of people I have is always changing. So sometimes when people get stuck in that identity, it's like they're afraid to grow. They're afraid to lose who they've been for this X amount of time. And it's like that inner child is crying to be let out. And being like, because our inner child knows who we really want to be.
Interesting. Yeah,
that's what I wrote in my books.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's really an exclusive sort of social media phenomenon, I think, right? Because we connect with people. We might go viral with sharing a story or sort of offering our thoughts on a particular subject. And we, I'm sure you found that, like, right when you start sharing your story, all of a sudden people they're paying attention to you, they're connecting, they're being so nice and supportive. You're like, I've never experienced this before. Like, people have never been this nice to me. But as soon as I tell people how awful I'm feeling or the things that have happened, they're like, oh, then they all of a sudden start being nice. And I think that sort of, helps us in a way, in a moment. But you're right, like the healing and growth part is such an important aspect to all of this, to the trauma, mental illness. We should always be striving to move forward, to get better, and not just sit in this place where, sure, we might be experiencing some external validation or support, but internally, like you said, like we're crying inside, we're in pain, we're suffering, we're lonely. And that's like my biggest concern sort of for like Generation Z and some of the younger folks who are growing up on apps like TikTok and Instagram. And I mean, we could have a whole another episode about social media and its effects, but that the psychological sort of factors of it in niching us down to like these sort of bite-sized subjects. It does worry me that people might become resistant to sort of like losing that part of themselves.
Yeah, and it's kind of like you have to look at it as this is a chapter in your life, and then when you start to feel that uneasiness or that like, well, I'm starting to lose who I am, you're not completely losing who you are. It's that chapter is closing so you can grow into the next one. You can't move on to the next chapter if you're still rereading or rewriting the last one. And yes, like social media plays a huge role now in these days. And we get told to niche down. And I'm like, okay, well, my niche is women trauma survivors. I can't niche down to an actual kind of abuse. But eventually, like, there will be changes in my business as I grow. And I'm like, I'm perfectly okay with that. Like, don't believe everything you see on social media. Like, the influencers, you can definitely tell them apart from like people like you and I. Because if they're putting always a positive spin on something, or they're always showing up like happy, 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 they're not gonna be someone who's going to help you in your journey.
Yeah. I almost find like we've moved past that sort of need, especially like the Instagram model of influencer. Like, I don't know, it's so weird now. I mean, this is a total side subject, but like, just, while it's on the top of my mind, just, we have so much going on in the world, and like they're hopping on being like, here, win this content. Like, I get it. People want distraction. People want, they don't want to go on social media and just see negativity all the time. I understand that part, but to me, sometimes it just seems so like tone deaf and obtuse to like the world. Like, you don't even mention anything that's going on. You're just sort of like navigating like the world is like pretty in roses. Like, I don't know. Just to me, I'm like, that doesn't resonate with me. It never really did, but it especially doesn't anymore.
Yeah, and it's just so true. So many of us put on those rose-colored glasses because we don't want to deal with our own past, our own, I don't want to say problems, but our own mental health. And that's why we usually put on those rose-colored glasses.
Yeah.
And look for like those giveaways or those happy people or all that. But as soon as you come across someone who hits home, like when you did your podcast with Angelica, it really hit home for me. There was something you said that really hit me deep. And I'm like, I needed this. And sometimes if we don't realize when we see that person on social media or find that person on the internet, it's life has a way of showing you who is meant to be in your life or what direction you need to be going in. And the more we fight it, the harder like life is just gonna be more resistant. I've literally been going through that myself.
Yeah. Before I let you go, for people who might be listening to this, who might find you on social media, you kind of mentioned, some people want to set up that exploratory call and then get to that point, and then they sort of like reschedule. So I'm just, I don't know if there's things you can't share or can share, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. If there's something you can't answer, no problem. But what does sort of like that initial step look like when someone's like books an exploratory call to like, start this journey? What could they expect from a call like that? Just to, give someone like a heads up and like give them like sort of like a preview of what it would be like to work with you.
Yeah, so I do 30-minute free discovery calls, and they're really just easygoing. There's no set agenda or anything. I always say like, I love to get to know you, what you're looking for, your goals, just a really brief history, because I can't give coaching that time. And then I just give an overview of myself and what I have to offer, like the different services and everything and my fees and everything. And it's just pretty laid back. I just meet over video, like Zoom. And, it's kind of like that get to know you. So it's like an interview, but it's not an interview, if that makes sense.
Like going for a cup of coffee.
Exactly. And it's just like, and if you really hit it off with the person, then give it a try. Like I always say, my services are also cheaper than therapy, like way cheaper. Like I'm not covered under insurance because I'm not regulated like that. But if it's something you want to try, give it a few sessions. Don't just say after one being like, I can't, like, this is not for me. Because the first session, I'm just gathering information, making sure you're in a safe space, and then getting some of that more of your history and everything. It's usually by the third, fourth ones where we really start to go into goals and different things, but it varies from client to client, right?
Yeah.
So I really just go with like the flow, but like give it some time. Don't give up after the first, second, or third one. But if you really can tell you're not a good fit, or I don't have experience what you're looking for, I have an association of coaches I can turn to. I can coach worldwide, so I can find someone in the States for you. I can find someone who's more of your niche, or we can work together and I just lean into the community.
Yeah, that's an important point. And I know it happens with therapy all the time. You have like sort of a bad experience, or like the first session's a little weird and it's not what you quite expect. And people like sort of give up. And it's like, no. Like, you're not just going to go to therapy and feel better. You're not going to just do this and just like one session be like, wow, all fixed up. Thanks, April. Like it's a process. It's time. It's ongoing. It's work. mental health is work. Recovery and healing is work. And it's the unfortunate part. It's not easy. It's hard. And at times it's really hard. But it's like important, and like the benefit way outweighs any sort of, you know, hardship that you might go through. Like right. It's like it's important hardship because it's going to get you better.
For sure. Like give it time.
Yeah. Do you just quickly, do you foresee like something like this, you know, maybe like becoming more like quote unquote mainstream, being covered by insurance down the line? Like, does it seem like that sort of might be a future for this line of work, or are people like still the establishment still like, you know, hokey pokey about it?
It's kind of hard because here in Ontario, you have to have your colleges designated for it.
Right.
I think they're trying in the States because they're based in the States, this program, but it's like life coaches. Life coaches aren't regulated, but they're still well-known. Like they're more mainstream now.
Yeah.
But if I can see trauma recovery coaching, growing. I can see it becoming more of a, not a norm, but more of that, like, okay, like we'll get you with a coach. We'll get you with someone who knows how to do this. It's just regulations. It's such a sticky topic. I've looked into it, and it's like you have to have that regulated body in your province.
Right.
And because they're from the States, it's a little bit stickier.
Right.
Because we have coaches all across the world. But I like the fact that like not being regulated allows me to coach across the world.
Right. Yeah. And I think, you know, as I have conversations continuously about the lack of mental health support, I think we can all look to sort of, you know, alternatives and other things to help us along the way. It fills a need, it fills a hole, it fills a gap of which we have, and it helps people. So I think it's wonderful work, and I appreciate that you sort of used the things that have happened and to go into it. If people want to like book you, give you a call, follow you on social media, I know you're great on Instagram. Where can we find you?
So the website is blossomingfromwithin.com, and there's like links to go book on there. And then on social media, I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Blossoming From Within, but there is no O in the from. Okay.
We'll make sure all those links are in the show notes. April, thank you so much again. Thank you for being open and vulnerable. Again, I know it's not easy, and I know having to rethink about those things are not easy. So I do really appreciate you considering this a safe space to do so. So thank you very much.
And thank you for having me on.